This is Outbreak News This Week, brought to you by the Global Dispatch Incorporated. Outbreak News This Week is your source for all the news about worms and germs. And now, your host, microbiologist and editor of OutbreakNewsToday.com. Here's Robert Harriman.
Well, good day, Tampa Bay, and welcome to your source for all the news about worms and germs. My name is Robert, and I appreciate you listening today. And I want to go ahead and start out the show right away with some Florida state news. There's plenty of it this week, and let's start with the Hepatitis A outbreak. And the Department of Health reported another 92 cases in the past week. And that's been the most reported in 1 week since the outbreak started in early 2018. So this really brings the outbreak up to 1,129 cases since the beginning of 2019 and almost 1,700 cases since the beginning of 2018. So it's really, really growing at a pretty steady pace. And as I've reported on the show in the past, that some places in the Tampa Bay area are the hardest hit in the state of Florida as a whole. Pinellas County, Pasco County, and Hillsborough County are 1, 2, and 4. Orange County is the third most hard-hit state with hepatitis A. Still reporting the most cases. Pinellas County is all the way up to 344 by itself. So it's just a enormous problem. But there's some other counties that we really haven't been talking about that are starting to report additional cases in the dozens, and that includes Marion, in Volusia and Seminole, and just north of here in Hernando. So it's definitely a problem, and the Florida Department of Health is really working hard, actively working to vaccinate those people that are most at risk for hepatitis A infection. And I encourage you to listen in next week, where I'll be having an epidemiologist from the Department of Health who's actually working on the ground on this hepatitis A outbreak, come in and talk a little bit about what's going on. So I encourage you to listen in next week for that program. Now, one of the local news sources in the Tampa Bay area, WFLA, put out a report several days ago, and they go through listing all the restaurants in the Tampa Bay area that are being investigated jointly by the Department of Health and the Division of Hotels and Restaurants. And these include restaurants in Hillsborough County, Pinellas, Pasco, and some of the ones that you're very familiar with, right? Hamburger Mary's and Taco Bell, Toasted Monkey, Sarasota County, Hernando. So yeah, there's a lot of outbreaks going on right now in the Tampa Bay area. Oh, there's a big outbreak in the Tampa Bay area, but there's a lot of restaurants that are reporting individuals, employees that have tested positive for hepatitis A, and various alerts are going out, of course, as these things pop up. So, and I'll link to that on the show notes page when I publish the podcast of the show. Another situation that's going on nationally, internationally, and predictions of this right here in our own backyard is the measles outbreak. We're seeing lots of measles cases in many countries overseas, and it's a major topic in the media of late. And the CDC just recently reported that we've gone over 800 cases since the beginning of the year in 23 states. And this is the greatest number of cases reported since 1994 in the United States. And since measles was actually declared eliminated in this country 19 years ago. Now, there was some new research that was recently published in the journal The Lancet Infectious Diseases. And they go through and they identify the top 25 counties in this country most at risk for a measles outbreak. And as you thumb through the list, you find that Hillsborough County is right there at number 17. And this is according to an analysis by researchers at the University of Texas at Austin and Johns Hopkins University. Now, the analysis considered an area's volume of international travel from different foreign countries with large measles outbreaks and the prevalence of non-medical exemptions from childhood vaccinations. Now, the lead author of the study, his name is Sohatra Sarkar. He's a philosophy and integrative biology professor at UT Austin and an expert on public health. He said that we have long known that vaccine avoidance is a critical public health issue in the U.S. and in Europe. And our results show how travel from these regions elsewhere compounds this risk. And I did get a chance to talk to Dr. Sarkar earlier this week on the podcast, Outbreak News Interviews. And we do a nice short podcast, talk about his research and how they come to some of these conclusions. So I encourage you to check that out on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher Radio, and Spotify. Well, continuing on with this, Sarkar and his team, their measles risk analysis correctly predicted areas in Washington State and Oregon and New York that are currently experiencing major outbreaks. Now, these researchers are warning that the most at-risk areas that have yet to report a case are those near international airports, like Travis County in Texas, Honolulu County, Salt Lake County in Utah, and multiple counties right here in the state of Florida. As a matter of fact, I think Miami-Dade was number 3 on the list. Fort Lauderdale, I think that's Broward, that was like in the top 10, and of course Hillsborough County, and I think there was some others too. So high on the risk for a measles outbreak. Well, the study also showed that travel from countries like India and China and Mexico, Japan, who's experiencing an outbreak, Ukraine and Philippines both have massive outbreaks right now, and Thailand. Travel from these areas appears to pose the greatest measles risk. And we've already seen cases imported from Ukraine, the Philippines, and Thailand. And if you're curious, what was the top county with the most risk for a measles outbreak? That would be Cook County, Illinois, Chicago, right? O'Hare Airport. And that was followed by Los Angeles County. And of course, as I said, Miami-Dade was third of the counties most at risk. So again, I encourage you to check out the podcast at Outbreak News Interviews when I talk to Dr. Sarkar about his analysis. Now we're heading into mosquito season, right? Rainy season. Mosquito breeding will soon be rising, and officials down in South Florida, right? They've been concerned in the past. Of course, they had the Zika issue not so long ago, and but Zika's not the main thing on their radar this year. And Dr. Bill Petrie, he's with the Miami-Dade County Mosquito Control, said, on the disease front, we're monitoring for different viruses on a weekly basis, and they're really ramping up their fight against mosquitoes down there. Because, like I said, we're headed to that season, and more standing water is going to mean more mosquito breeding. Dr. Petrie had to say, at the moment we're testing selected traps, different mosquitoes once a week for dengue, Zika, and chikungunya, and they have got increased staffing for this year. And they're also placing more traps, nearly 200 traps, all throughout Miami-Dade, trying to get ahead of the viral issues from some of these mosquitoes. And, of course, the big concern this year is actually not Zika. It's dengue, according to Petrie. Petrie is the head of Miami-Dade's County Mosquito Control Division. And he says, I think that the increased surveillance is key. And the increase in number of personnel is also key. Zika is not actually the main concern this year. It's dengue. And why is that? He said after a relatively tame season last year, his concern is once again rising after they've noticed a spike in the number of dengue fever cases throughout different islands of the Caribbean and, of course, South America. And we've reported on that on recent past shows. Brazil has already seen about 500,000 cases. So it's already off the charts, and it's May. It's May. So it's a lot of that stuff could become imported, and so there's a lot of issues there. And Miami-Dade is, again, one of those international areas where the airport and all that, and they are a hub for basically all the Central and South American countries and the Caribbean. And a lot of these people do come through Miami. That means increased exposure if a case is discovered locally. One way the county is continuing to remind residents to fight the bite is draining and covering any standing water. So that's a concern down there. This year, they say they're looking out for dengue fever. So us at the website, outbreaknewstoday.com, will be keeping a close eye on what goes on down in southern Florida. And sticking with the topic of southern Florida and mosquitoes, a report from Futurism, they talk about that the residents of South Florida may soon see small unmanned aerial vehicles flying over the community, right? Or in other words, drones. And the Florida Keys Mosquito Control District plans on launching a new project that aims to utilize drones to stop the spread of potentially harmful mosquitoes. The officials say the organization will spend the entire summer spraying and distributing larvicide over salt marshes and other remote areas using the drones. The project will mainly target the Aedes aegypti mosquito species, which carries, of course, Zika and dengue. Now, the Florida Keys hopes the project will eliminate the breeding grounds of the mosquitoes and reduce the population. Officials also said that the high-tech effort will help the local government save a lot of money, right? Because the drones will seek these remote pools of standing water, which in the past was assigned to large manned helicopters. So in order to dispatch a helicopter to treat those very small sites, it's very, very expensive for the mosquito district. And each drone can carry about up to 8 pounds of larvicide, which is enough basically to spray a couple acres. Now, let me get her name here. Andrea Leal, she's the executive director of the Florida Keys Mosquito Control District. She says, it's only treating very small areas. We want to make sure that we're precise with this. It's really starting out, seeing exactly what this can do for us. So the Mosquito Control District plans to conduct the initial launch of the project on a couple sites in Key Largo to test the drones and their effectiveness of the larvicide. So we'll be keeping an eye on that and see how that works out. It sounds pretty brilliant, especially when you're dealing with trying to do mosquito control on spot areas instead of a large swath of area, right? So yeah, we'll be keeping an eye on that. Publix announced a recall earlier this week through a St. Petersburg company called Seven Seas International, and they're recalling their 4-ounce Biltmore smoked sockeye salmon. Why? Well, there's the chance that it could be contaminated with Listeria monocytogenes. Florida Department of Ag, they discovered this through just routine regulatory testing. And this sockeye salmon was only distributed in Florida by Publix grocery stores. So, yeah. Why is Listeria an issue, right? Because this organism can cause some serious and sometimes fatal infections in young children, the elderly, those weakened immune systems. Now, healthy people like me, like Mike, may only suffer short-term symptoms like a fever, headache, nausea, and some other type of symptoms, pretty non-specific symptoms, right? But Listeria infection can cause miscarriages and stillbirths among the pregnant women. So yeah, it can be a real serious thing, and this is exactly why they tell pregnant women to avoid soft cheeses and deli meats and hot dogs and that kind of stuff, because those often are contaminated with Listeria. So you definitely want to avoid that. And if you want to find out more about this recall, I'll go ahead and post a link on the show notes page when I publish the podcast. So you check out the specifics of this item for yourself. Well, I've had different people on the show from University of Florida in the past, particularly the Emerging and Pathogens Institute. They're doing a lot of great work up there concerning mosquito-borne diseases and diseases in dogs and other types of things like that. Well, there's a new study that reveals for the first time the global estimate of anthrax risk through maps. So it's really a fascinating paper. And in these maps, they reveal for the first time where anthrax poses the biggest global risk to people, livestock, and wildlife all across the planet. And a lot of people are confused with anthrax. What they know is what they've heard in the media, right? It's this, especially the post 9/11 anthrax letters. It's an agent of bioterrorism. Yeah, and that's a very important thing, right? I'm not downplaying it, but it's very common in many parts of the world, causing infections because it's just naturally occurring in the soil, just about everywhere. Now, the maps were published in a journal called Nature Microbiology, and I will link to that on the show notes page also. And they spent 15 years collecting the data from dozens of countries. And this is the first time that the geographic distribution of anthrax has ever been mapped on a global scale. So it's very, very new, very, very important research. One of the authors of the paper, he's a professor up at University of Florida. His name is Jason Blackburn. He says, our main purpose was to describe where anthrax occurs or is likely to occur across the globe and to illustrate subnational areas where surveillance is necessary. Now, anthrax, he says, is a disease that affects both animals and humans, and it's most commonly associated with rural and agricultural communities, which contend with it nearly worldwide. Our maps will help countries and health authorities focus on specific anthrax-prone areas to target control and surveillance. So Blackburn, who's a professor up at UF and actually in the geography department, his team mapped out the known occurrences and the suitable habitats for Bacillus anthracis, which is the bacteria that causes anthrax, as a proxy for disease risk. They then overlaid this with models showing where people, livestock, and susceptible wildlife occur. The team, here's some interesting things that they found. They say they found that 1.83 billion people inhabit anthrax risk areas. But then they trimmed down that number a lot, to about 63.8 million workers who engage in agricultural occupations, which place them at heightened risk of contracting the disease. In addition, they mapped the livestock by species type and found that anthrax vulnerable areas contain over 1 billion livestock, right? Cattle and other goats, sheep, all those things are very vulnerable to anthrax. Blackburn says this tells medical clinicians and veterinarians that if they are inside a predicted zone, anthrax should be on their routine diagnostic list, or at least their annual vaccination list. The best way to protect people is to routinely vaccinate livestock. Now, there is a very effective livestock vaccine, but it has to be given on an annual basis. The immunity that's built up by this vaccine wanes pretty quickly, so these livestock animals have to be vaccinated on an annual basis. And concerning Bacillus anthracis, in the soil where you're going to find it's in a spore form, right? It's the non-vegetative stage, and it can live there for years and up to decades, really. It's really resistant to the environment, the sun, the rain, the weather, UV radiation. It's just resistant. It's very, very hardy. So it's very important that these sustained vaccination campaigns continue in these regions where they have outbreaks, even when there are no known outbreaks because of the risk. Now there's some incredible areas of sub-Saharan Africa and the South and East Asia tend to have vaccination rates that range from less than 1% to 6%. But the researchers found that these regions disproportionately account for 48.5 million rural, poor livestock keepers. Internationally, Blackburn says, we need to do a better job of getting the vaccine to high-risk areas. Now, as far as human anthrax, it's a wide range. Just like somewhere between 20,000 and 100,000 people are reported with anthrax annually around the world. And of course, it's mostly in rural areas and poor areas. Here in the United States, it's really, really rare because, at least in part, because we have very good high rates of livestock vaccination in areas that are disease prone. And if you're curious, the areas that are disease prone here in the United States is basically the upper Midwest, right? North Dakota, South Dakota, parts of western Minnesota, parts of eastern Montana, going straight down into different areas of Texas. So it's those kind of grasslands and stuff like that that are pretty notorious for anthrax bacillus. Now, the research has implications for wildlife of conservation priority. Like up in Canada, we see issues with anthrax outbreaks periodically with the wood bison. And sometimes we see it with antelope and game animals like white-tailed deer down here. We've seen that in Texas before. And of course, we can't vaccinate wildlife, but knowing where the anthrax is likely to occur can inform hunters as well as livestock growers who have close proximity to this wildlife to prevent the spillover events on either direction. So, yeah, I encourage you to check that out. It's a really interesting study. I will post that on the show notes page, as I always do. Okay, getting close to the break. I encourage you again, check out the website, outbreaknewstoday.com. The podcast, Outbreak News Interviews, on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher Radio, and Spotify. And also check out our presence on YouTube at Outbreak News TV. Okay, see ya after the break. Come on back.
Outbreak News This Week, your source for all the news about worms and germs. Here's your host, microbiologist and editor of OutbreakNewsToday.com, Robert Harriman.
Well, welcome back to the show. Let's go ahead and jump into some international news. And one of the more interesting stories that I saw in the past week was in Hong Kong. And the Center for Health Protection over there reported investigating 3 cases of human infection of rat hepatitis E virus. And they're really, encouraging the public to be vigilant against hepatitis E infection and to strictly observe good personal, food, environmental hygiene, and the like. And looks like all 3 of the cases were in elderly men. All 3 had underlying health conditions. 2 of the men were stable most of the time, and they never even required hospitalization, which is good. However, a 3rd case, he was admitted to one of the local hospitals in Hong Kong, and he did end up passing away. So one gentleman did die from this rat hepatitis E virus. And it was confirmed, it was laboratory confirmed, in all 3 of them. The epidemiology was a little tricky here when I'm looking at this report, because these 3 patients resided in 3 different areas, 3 different cities, respectively. They could not, recall having direct contact with rodents or their waste, nor have they noticed rodents in their residence. One of the patients did travel to Taiwan and Korea during the incubation period. However, the 2 others had no travel history during that time. So, based on that, right, Hong Kong officials really don't have any idea what the source of the outbreak or the infections are, or the route of the infection. The pest control advisory section of Hong Kong has been told about this, and they're carrying out rodent control measures and survey in those areas. And right now, we don't know a whole lot about rat hepatitis E virus. And in fact, the exact mode of transmission, from the rat or the rat excrement to humans, we really don't know anything concerning that transmission cycle. Now, what we do know is with hepatitis E virus, the one that causes human infections, that's typically transmitted via the fecal-oral route. So fecal contamination of the water, food transmission, and then it's also been detected in different meat products, particularly pigs. And hepatitis E has been detected in pig livers. And anyway, so clearly it's severe enough that one of these men died. So we'll be keeping an eye on what goes on in Hong Kong, and if they can pinpoint anything concerning this rat hepatitis E virus. Okay, let's come back to Kentucky, and we'll chalk this up to irony, right? You may remember, 2 months ago, maybe a little bit more, we talked about on the show about the high school student up in Kentucky who was suing the health department because they wouldn't let him go to school or go to different events because he refused to get vaccinated. Right. This is when this area, this town, this school was going through a chickenpox outbreak, and they had, 30-something cases. Well, as I said, irony, the young man's name is Jerome Kunkel. Well, last week he got chickenpox. About 2 weeks after health department issued an order to control an outbreak in these different parochial schools up in Boone County, Kentucky. And Christopher Wiest, I'm taking it that's his attorney who filed the lawsuit. he's got some things to say that didn't sit with me too well. First of all, he says, "Oh, he's fine. He's a little itchy." Okay, yeah, that may be true. Okay, he's fine. He's a little itchy. But later on, we said, about that he noted that during the hearing, during this lawsuit back in April, that the Sacred Heart community, I guess that's the school that the young guy went to, on a regular basis celebrated Mass together and shared meals on Sundays. So school attendance restrictions would not have prevented the spread of chickenpox. And he goes on to say, about half of my clients have come down with it since we filed the case. I flat out told moms and dads the quickest path to resolving this is having them contract chickenpox. Well, yeah. If that didn't sit well with you, you understand what I was talking about. Well, and it did sit well with the health department up there, right? And they expressed some concern about Weist, his words, and pointing out that people who contract chickenpox can expose others to the virus before the disease becomes apparent. The health department said in a statement, encouraging the spread of an acute infectious disease in a community demonstrates a callous disregard for the health and safety of friends, family, neighbors, and unsuspecting members of the general public. A person who has contracted chickenpox can be infectious for up to 2 days before experiencing the rash that's typically associated with the disease. So back in, a couple months ago, the high school student, and he wasn't alone either, their school, a lot of people in the school have religious exemptions against vaccinations. And that goes back to 50 years ago when some of these vaccines were first made with laboratory-generated cells taken from a aborted fetus 50-odd years ago. It's not made with aborted fetal cells constantly. It was it was at one time, right? But so the health department goes on to say that control measures such as restricted school attendance, participation in extracurricular activities, and instructing those who have symptoms to avoid contact with others are designed to prevent unvaccinated people who have been exposed to the virus from infecting members of the general public while they're infectious. Anyway, to make a long story short, Kunkel, the boy, he caught chickenpox. Weiss, the lawyer, had some pretty foolish things to say, and they lost the lawsuit, right? The judge ruled against Kunkel. It's going to the Kentucky Court of Appeals that hasn't decided yet. So the school attendance ban, as we speak, remains in effect. So pretty crazy stuff up there in northern Kentucky. Well, measles, we're talking about 839 cases here in the United States as of the recording of this radio program. The World Health Organization has declared an outbreak in 11 countries around the world, and 3 of them are right in Southeast Asia. And we've kind of touched on this already with other diseases, but the Philippines, they're battling dengue fever, they're battling the measles. Thailand, Myanmar, global cases of measles have went up 300% just in the first 3 months of 2019 compared to last year. And this has got some governments scrambling to contain it. And some of these countries had previously eliminated measles, and now they're seeing the disease come back. And a lot of it's due to complacent attitudes and public skepticism over vaccines. And also in some of these countries, like the Philippines, the outbreak is straining the public health funds earmarked for other healthcare needs. For example, Dr. Takeshi Kasai, he's the WHO regional director for the Western Pacific. He says this about the Philippines. The current outbreak in the Philippines is a reminder of how swiftly and easily measles can make a comeback in communities where too few people are immunized. And in the Philippines, it's well over 30,000 cases and 400 or 500 fatalities just in the first 4 months. So it's a serious situation. And just to piggyback on the financial strain that the country's battling right now, there's a senior economist at ING Bank in Manila. His name is Nicholas Antonio Mapa. And he's the one that's saying that the outbreak is really straining the country's health budget. He says, quote, "This will undoubtedly take a toll on the government's healthcare system, with previous immunity acquired maybe muted and leading to increased funding for treatment of the sick." And the good thing is that the government has been reporting a decline in cases as of recent. I imagine more people are getting vaccinated, right? But as of now, the Philippine government is reluctant to say this outbreak is over. Health Secretary Francisco Duque, he told reporters recently, "We see now a significant but not substantial reduction in the number of measles cases. So far it's under control, but I don't like to say that the outbreaks are over." So, yeah. So we got that going on. Thailand's battling it. Myanmar is battling it. And of course, a lot of the problem is, at least in the Philippines, is the public confidence in the vaccines. Because of what happened, 2-3 years ago with the Sanofi Pasteur dengue vaccine, Dengvaxia, where there was such a debacle, and I talked about that previously on the show. Well, a lot of people took that to heart. All vaccines are bad for you like that. And hence, we have a major measles epidemic in the country. All right, well, let's come back to the States and look at something really bizarre. And I wish I had contacted somebody, an expert on this, to get their thoughts. I mean, clearly it's bogus, but I would like to get professional thoughts other than me sitting back here saying it's bogus. But let me go ahead and talk about it. It's there's a guy in Texas who got arrested, charged, and sent to jail for a long time for child pornography distribution. And this man's name is Irving Jose Marquez. He's a 30-year-old guy, and he received a maximum sentence last week after pleading guilty to federal charges of recording and distributing videos depicting situations, sexual exploitation of children. Let me just wrap it up with that. Well, he claims, and his attorney says, that he suffered brain damage because of a West Nile virus infection back in 2009. And his attorney says he wasn't in his right mind. And because he contracted West Nile in 2009, the virus subsequently made him sexually aggressive. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. You can send me an email, outbreaknews1@gmail.com. I would love to get your thoughts on that. And if you're any kind of expert on West Nile or psychiatry, I don't know. I mean, any of those kind of sciences that would may know the answer whether a West Nile infection, prior West Nile infection, would make you sexually aggressive. I would love to hear more about that. So drop me a line if you have an answer to that. All right. New research on Lyme disease that's being published Well, I got the press release off of Global Lyme Alliance, and they say they have a new joint study that was conducted by the scientists at the Global Lyme Alliance and Brown University that say that more than 2 million people in the U.S. could suffer profound disability from post-treatment Lyme disease syndrome, PTLDS, by the year 2020, right? Next year. More than 2 million people. Now, the study was published in the journal BMC Public Health, and it used advanced mathematical modeling to calculate the total number of patients with PTLD, which is basically a disorder which causes about 10 to 20% of Lyme disease patients to suffer from severe symptoms long after their antibiotic treatment has ended, even if their initial infection was promptly diagnosed and correctly treated. PTLD can cause a variety of symptoms, including incapacitating fatigue, chronic pain, and neurocognitive impairment. Symptoms are often so severe that normal schedules for work, school, and personal lives are derailed. So, the lead investigator, her name is Allison DeLong. She's a biostatistician at Brown. Said there were two goals of the study. Her first was to develop a rigorous mathematical framework for estimating the prevalence of PTLD in the U.S. The second goal was to actually calculate it to provide some projections for 2020. And she says, and I quote, "To our knowledge, this is the first time such work has been done, and we feel it was time to address these deficits." So, yeah, interesting study published in BMC Public Health. And I definitely encourage you to check it out. I'll link to it on the show notes page, so you can check it out for yourself. Well, guess what happened in New York's? I think it was New York City, Rockland County, New York. Right? They have a big measles outbreak up there. It's only stone's throw away from New York City itself, where they're having even a larger measles outbreak in the Brooklyn area. They had a, quote, vaccine symposium, close quote, in Rockland County. And they had some interesting speakers who were spreading some propaganda, to put it mildly, some propaganda. There was an ultra-Orthodox rabbi who described the measles outbreak among the Jews as part of an elaborate plan concocted by Mayor Bill de Blasio of New York to deflect attention from more serious diseases brought in by the Central American immigrants. There was a pediatrician who questioned whether Jews were being intentionally given bad lots of vaccines that ended up giving children a new strain of the virus. And then, of course, the anti-vaxxer among all anti-vaxxers, Dr. Andrew Wakefield. You remember him from his studies that linked the measles vaccine with autism, which is, of course, today widely discredited and condemned. I showed up on a screen from via Skype, offering an almost apocalyptic vision of a world in which vaccines were given to rise to deadlier immunization-resistant diseases. So, yeah, let's take a look at some more stuff that happened there. The event was held in a large ballroom, as is customary at ultra-Orthodox gatherings. The remarks and the wrapped-off audience illustrated how the anti-vaccination movement can exploit fear and anxiety within relatively insular communities, especially religious ones, to undercut scientifically sound warnings from health experts. Now, the pediatrician who spoke out during the event, Dr. Lawrence Polevsky, he's frequently cited in pamphlets circulating in New York City that urge women not to get their children vaccinated. He was there, and at the rally, he talked quite a bit at length about mutating viruses, falsely claimed that failed vaccines were producing new strains of measles. And, wow, it's just like one thing after the other. Here's a quote from Wakefield. He says, "I wanted to reassure you that I have never been involved in scientific fraud. What happened to me is what happens to doctors threatened with the bottom line of the pharmaceutical companies." Yeah, some crazy stuff. I'll have to link to this paper too, because this news report. Let me see what it's from. I want to say it's from the New York Times, but I'll have to double check that. But I will link to it. Then RFK Jr., he's always out there standing by the anti-vaxxers, and he was in Albany last week, and he's out there rallying against the proposed strengthening of New York's vaccination law. Never mind, we're having the largest outbreak in decades, but yeah, there's RFK Jr. And basically the measure that's going on, that they're being introduced up in New York, is to eliminate the religious exemption for vaccinations. And Kennedy, RFK Jr. says, quote, "They're telling us now that we're going to censor Facebook because they want to get rid of misinformation about vaccines. But we're just talking about science. We're giving them peer review. You'll never hear peer review from a vaccine proponent." Okay, RFK Jr., I don't know how true that statement is. I think I have a Facebook page where there's a lot of anti-vaxxers that come to put their comments. They put all these links to all these natural health magazines and websites and all that kind of stuff. Then there's people that are pro-vaccine that go on there and they chop these down, and then they introduce links to true studies. And so what Mr. Kennedy is saying is, I don't buy it. I don't buy it. Then he goes on to say, "What you'll hear is appeals to authority." What does that mean? That vaccines are safe because the CDC says they're safe. So that's what the vaccine proponent will do. They'll say, the anti-vaxxer will give you all this peer review information, and the vaccine proponent will say, the CDC says it's safe, so I know it's okay. Well, I don't think that's exactly how it works. And even members of Kennedy's own family say he's really wrong and discouraging parents from vaccinating their kids. They say that he has helped to spread dangerous misinformation over social media and is complicit in sowing distrust of the science behind vaccines. So yeah, so right now up in New York City, it's almost 500 cases. Rockland County is over 225. There's a lot of measles in New York, just in that little area. Then there was some research that looked at that gonorrhea may be transmitted via French kissing. And that was from a study in sexual transmitted infections. And that was done some researchers down in Australia. So I encourage you to check that one. I'll try to link to that also. That's a pretty weird one. And then there's a study in emerging infectious diseases, which looks at lab accidents of polio over the years and how that could risk eradication. Okay, again, the website, outbreaknewstoday.com. And I will see you next week on Outbreak News This Week. Good day, and God bless.
Thank you for listening to Outbreak News This Week with Robert Harriman. If you missed any part of today's program, you can listen to the podcast anytime on our website, outbreaknewstoday.com. Make sure to join us here next week for Outbreak News This Week with Robert Harriman.